Okay, welcome back. So we are on Unit 4, and I'm trying to re-record lectures from each of the units. And I'd already recorded the lecture on architecture, which is actually the second lecture of Unit 4. But that's what the students who were sitting in on that lecture requested. So I did that instead of doing the one that covered the late antiquity, late classical art into early Christian art. So I'm doing that lecture now. This is the art historical lecture for Unit 4, where we basically take the transition from the ancient world, from the classical world, from late antiquity to the medieval world. And this transition is a lot um, about Christianity and the influences that Christianity has on the art that people are making. But before we get started, I wanted to kind of just go over a little bit about the transition from Hellenistic art to Roman art. And please ignore Diesel. He's a big dummy of a dog. Anyway, so Hellenistic sculpture. So this is fourth century, I think, until I can't quite see, till the first century. And and here we have a number of Roman copies of Hellenistic sculptures so that we can see that the Romans were very much interested in studying Greek sculpture, both Hellenistic sculpture and Hellenic sculpture. Diesel. We also have some examples, or a lot of examples, of Republican art, especially art that is kind of patrician. Come in, come in. So, okay, he's going to be quiet now. I got him by the collar. Okay, so where were we? So we have a lot of examples of artwork that looks a little bit strange to us in terms of antiquity, in terms of the classical period, because these look a lot more like portraiture. And if you pay much Diesel, no, sit, well, sit. Okay, there we are. If you paid much attention to the artwork that we were talking about, I talked about how the classical Greeks, the Hellenistic Greeks, were quite uncomfortable with portraiture, especially with portraiture looking exactly like the model. Settle down, Diesel. But the Romans had a different tradition, which was they had a tradition of death masks, where they would, um, for um, for the patriarchs of their family, when the lead male member of the family died, they would make a wax plaster, a wax mask of that face, a death mask, and then from that they would make plaster casts. And the really wealthy families would then also then commission sculptors to make copies of those. So they were making these kind of like, and then these would be busts, a lot of like with this portrait right here, where he's holding these small little busts that are just kind of like, just kind of neck and a little bit of shoulder. And these would then be kept in the family crypt. So this gives us a little bit of a different sense of who the Romans were, both their comfortableness with portraiture, their interest, but also their kind of conservatism. You know, they were more interested in sculptural art serving a very specific religious purpose. And so then we can see how the influences of Hellenistic art and of these other earlier um, trends in Roman art kind of come together when we get to the Roman Empire. Okay. And so here looking at the Roman Empire, and we're going to look at some of these actually in the next lecture, the one on late antiquity, because some of these come pretty late. So like the Triumphal Arch of Constantine, we'll look at some details from that. Okay. And I think this is where, oh no, I also talked about these. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I just wanted to kind of show you those images and to help give you a sense of how we went from like one place to another. Okay, now we're going to get to the heart of what we're doing today. this unit. Okay, and a lot of this is some review, just the same as what we had just saw. And so these Fayum portraits, I maybe should talk about them a little bit. They're Egyptian, but during the Roman period. And this is kind of the tradition. These are painted in encaustic, and we'll talk about them a little bit more when we get to the painting unit and talking about encaustic, which is where you paint with molten wax. And these are sort of like what the Egyptians start doing in, if you remember ancient Egyptians, they would have like sarcophagi. They'd have these carved heads that would be put the on top of the coffins that people would be buried in. These would be painted kind of pieces that would then be affixed to the top of a coffin that someone was buried in. And they are frequently, we see most of these portraits are of young boys or young men who probably died at a young age. But they're really beautiful. And we also have, it's kind of a shame that from the little bits of Roman painting that we see, we know that the Greeks must have also had an amazing tradition of painting, but we have so little of it. We have maybe just a little bit of mosaics here or there and a little bit of painting, and then what we have referenced in the painting on pottery. Uh, but fortunately for us, not fortunate for those who lived in Pompeii, we have some really very, very detailed and very well preserved frescoes from Pompeii because Pompeii was basically completely covered in ash from a volcano, killing everyone who lived there, but basically preserving a town and all the art of that town, like in an instant. So, um, a boon for archaeologists if horrific tragedy for the people who lived there. Okay, so from early Christian to Gothic. So point of this lecture is to kind of decide or to help us figure out like how we went from that ancient world to this world and even all the way to the medieval period, to the late Gothic. How do we get from there? And the thing about this lecture is that this is lightning speed. I'm going through this really fast. And in fact, actually, I just added a bunch of stuff to this, but even still, it's pretty lightning speed. So here we have from Augustus to Emperor Justinian. And it's also from about 450 years of time. And how do we get from here to here? Okay, so starting with the late empire, we start to see certain trends where even before Christianity had become accepted in the empire, there were already official art was starting to become a little bit more symbolic, like more interested in, like if you look at the way this head is carved, there are a lot of decisions that are made to to emphasize features over proportion, right? So like the eyes are really large, everything is like a little bit over exaggerated for better readability, better communication. And that was kind of like an ongoing sort of development or process going on in the Roman Empire. When you think about it, the Roman Empire was very diverse, people from, all over. And as the art developed, it became more important to the Romans, the Roman state, um, to the emperors and all the levels below the emperor that ran things, all the consuls and governors. It was important to them that the art really kind of like speak to everyone in this very diverse empire. And so the official style moved towards a style that was much more put emphasis on a communication rather than on the classical ideals of like repose and the search for an ideal form and the search for ideal proportions. So one of the things here, like you can see that Constantine is in parts, and that's because the original sculpture, lots of it would have been made out of different materials, but only only certain parts where we could actually see the skin were made out of marble. Okay, so early Christian art. Continuing with Constantine, we have an image from the Arch of Constantine, and notice down here how we have, unlike in most of Roman art, where they really followed the Greek rule of naturalistic proportion, where people who are supposed to be the same size are drawn the same size. Here we're using hierarchical scale, where less important people are made much smaller, and then really important people are made much larger, in order for the purposes of telling the narrative, the story, and making clear communication. So this is again getting at my point that these were trends that were happening in Roman art even before Christianity became even an accepted religion, let alone the official religion of the empire. The other thing that we're looking at here is an image of a recreation of what the Basilica of Oppia would have looked like. And the reason why I want you to see this is because this is not a Christian building by any means. Um, Back at this time in 112 CE, basilicas were the primary, they were kind of like the Romans' version of a forum. The Greeks had these buildings that they called forums that were um, or agoras, right? Where these were places for people to gather. And the Greek agora was mostly on the outside, and you had these colonnades, and that's where people would set up shops. And the Romans basically took the agora idea and flipped it inward, where the whole thing was under a roof. So they basically kind of like they took a kind of a flea market sort of idea, and then they turned it into a, a flea mall, right? Like where it's all under one roof. Okay, but it's not a flea market. But it is a place where there would have been both business and official, and like civic business. There would have been like people would have been vendors there selling things, but there also would have been the place where you would have gone to have court decisions made and stuff like that. Okay. And so this kind of building becomes the basis, the basic structure that then the Christians later adopt as their primary kind of like floor plan for churches. And that's a lot of this lecture is going to be focused on churches and church structure, just so you know. But I also wanted to show you some art of other kinds, like some paintings. And so here we're like making this transition. And these are both, all three of these are Christian art, but basically the non-Christian art of the same time period would have looked not that different. At this point, Christian art was just a subset of Roman art, of late antiquity art. But you can see that these same kind of traditions or same kind of I don't know, desires are developing in the artwork where we're using more hierarchical scales in images, and especially between different friezes, like really having some friezes where the figures are quite large and other parts where the figures are quite small. But even in certain parts, there's a lot of difference between the scale of figures. There's much more of an emphasis on kind of like the idea of like someone is large because they're important. And yeah, clarity of communication. Okay, and here we have some more leading all the way up to 400 CE. So earlier I had mentioned about the basilica form, right? And so the early Christians adopt the basilica, which has the basic idea of like sort of an outside wall and then colonnades that run up and down on either side of that form. And they kind of adopt that basilica form as the basic style for a church. And why is that? Why didn't they use like temples? Because they already had, the Romans had religious buildings. Why didn't they use religious buildings as kind of like the starting point for building churches? And the reason is because religious buildings in the ancient world, in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, or ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Persia, ancient Jerusalem, right? Temples in those parts of the world all had basically were all designed to have most of the worship done on the outside, on the steps, on the portico, around the outside of the building. The inside of the building was designed to be reserved just for the highest of priests, right? It was like as it's described in the Old Testament, the Holy of Holies, right? The sacred part of the inside of the temple was only supposed to be visited by the people who you were, only the special. Whereas Christian worship starts from being, people worshiping in homes and houses, and they have a communal meal together, right? They basically do kind of a symposium, right? Where they all kind of gather, they read to each other, they talk, they might, they do hymns, they sing, but all together as a group. And so the Christian, the Roman Christians needed to start having a new type of architecture where you could house everyone all in one building. And what about in a big city where now all of a sudden you have a congregation of 400 or 1,000 people? You need big spaces. So here is Santa Sabina from the outside or from the inside. And so we have that basic kind of like internal colonnade structure of a um of a basilica, but we already have the addition of the apse over here, that rounded part on the outside going around. Here is the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. Whoop, I went too far. Okay, which just takes what we saw in Santa Sabina and expands it, right? We don't have well, basically we have a lot of the same structure. So we have we have a flat kind of, probably that's wooden in terms of supports. We have a flat ceiling going across, and then it's supported by a colonnade on either side. And here we have the Basilica of San Vitale, and which is in Ravenna. I have both an example of the outside. The main reason I want to show you is I wanted you to look at um, the mosaics on the inside, which are pretty amazing, and including this one, which is, so this is, at this point, Ravenna was part of what would, one of the things to remember is that at this point, the Roman Empire had split in half. There was a Western half with a Western emperor and an Eastern half with an Eastern emperor. And so Justinian was on the Eastern half. So essentially one of the early Byzantine emperors. And remember, the Eastern half of the Roman Empire lasted all the way into the 15th century. So we tend to think of the Roman Empire having failed around the 6th, 7th century CE, because that's when it failed in France and England and in Germany. But that's not when it failed in um, in what is today Turkey or Greece or in that part of the world. Okay. So continuing with architecture, so I do need to explain a little bit. I kind of skipped, I don't have a caption for this, but this architecture here is a chapel. Can't remember where it's at, but it's a Merovingian chapel. So the Merovingians was a small kind of dynasty, a group of rulers starting with Clovis, I think. And anyway, um, starting roughly around the 5th century, 6th century, and that dynasty eventually led to the Carolingian dynasty, which is Charlemagne, right? And at first they were in a relatively small part of France, but the Merovingians kind of like slowly started to expand their power and spread um, their architectural ideas. Interestingly enough, these columns were most likely taken from an old Roman temple and repurposed for this chapel. And then here we have a Carolingian chapel, which is the chapel of Charlemagne, who was the first ruler of Europe after the end of the Roman Empire to kind of, sort of, be an emperor again of the whole of Europe, briefly and kind of, sort of. Okay, and here I have some more images just to give you a sense of what art was going on. There was a lot of illuminated manuscript books, right? And this is Carolingian. We also, but a lot of it is also, we have a lot of carved ivory. And what's interesting is we have a lot of carved ivory from lots of different parts, a lot of different time periods. So it gives us a good comparison. But we also, in a lot of parts of Europe, we have artwork that is completely unrelated to both the classical period and unrelated to the Christian art, because this is coming from um, people who are, this is called the migration era, and this is coming from people who are moving into Europe from other parts, primarily Germanic people who are bringing their own culture and especially decorative arts that look quite different. But we will later see this kind of decorative approach start to be applied to things like illuminated manuscripts. Okay, and then into the Ottonian, so we had Merovingian, and keep in mind that these are like still relatively small. They kind of expand in power periodically, but we're still not talking about all of Europe at any one time. So there's not like everyone's on the same page. But we have this Merovingian period that leads to the Carolingian period, which then there's an offshoot into Germany, which is the Ottonian period. And here is a great example. St. Michael's of Hildesheim is a great example of Ottonian architecture. It's kind of almost, it's pre-Romanesque. It has a lot of the suggesting where Romanesque is going to go. And then here's St. Sarnian. So when we get to after the Romanesque is really the first kind of international style of architecture and art in Europe post the uh, Roman Empire. So like during these periods, like I just told you, like the Merovingian, Carolingian, Ottonian, these are these are, you know, in they are isolated geographically, and it doesn't mean that there's everything is going on the same everywhere in Europe. By the time we get to the Romanesque, we start to have kind of this everyone's on the same page sort of quality. And so Romanesque art, Romanesque cathedrals and churches generally have rounded arches, although by the time we get to the end of the Romanesque, we do have the introduction of pointed arches, but it's mostly dominated by rounded arches. We have a lot of places where we're using straight barrel vaults, a lot of places where we're using a simple um, groin vault, where one barrel vault and another barrel vault meet at the same height. Gets much more complicated when we get to Gothic architecture. And also, a lot of the Romanesque is a lot less decorated than the Gothic, but there are exceptions. Like some of the Romanesque cathedrals in Spain are pretty ornate. Here's another view of Saint Sernin, Cernin, and then we get to the Gothic. And I could have gone to Saint Denis first, but I just went straight to Chartres, which is one of the great works of art of all time, one of the masterpieces of architecture. And it is a gorgeous building, and it's an example of what we call Gothic architecture. So in Gothic architecture, we have a much greater use of, notice just how much more complex the floor plan is, right? And how it's like the basic basilica structure is there, but it's really kind of like it's hard to figure it out. It's kind of hidden in the floor plan. Also, in Gothic architecture, we have pointed arches, and pointed arches then mean and we have ribbed vaulting. You see how like we have like these kind of like bars that run along everywhere that vaults meet. You have this extra support that's called a rib. So the use of both ribbed vaulting and pointed arches allows a whole different kind of vaulting system, because like a Gothic ribbed vault can do a lot more than a straight groin vault of two barrel vaults intersecting. One with Gothic ribbed vault, you can connect one vaulting system of one height to another vaulting system of a completely different height, because with pointed arches, you can just stretch them to whatever point you need them to go to, right? Whereas with rounded arches, there is no real way to do that. And It also means that we can, um, yeah, we can connect vaulting systems of different heights, and it's just a lot more fluid and flexible. And here on the outside, we can see the starting use of flying buttresses as a support system. And so this is one of the things about Gothic cathedrals is that they just feel like they're just lifting upward. They feel almost effortlessly weightless, right? And as I discussed in my lecture on architecture, this is kind of like the opposite of what most of the tradition of making architecture, making buildings, most of the tradition, especially of making religious buildings, has been about, where it's always about kind of communicating the weight, making sure that we can clearly see where the weight is going. And there are things that the builders did in these Gothic cathedrals that do that to a degree. We still see supports, we still see columns, but it's much more about lifting upward and that lift upward seemingly being impossible, or like just raising the ceiling to the heavens. And a lot of that has to do with these outside support systems. It's only possible for those ceilings to be raised as high as they are because if you didn't have those outside support systems, the walls would buckle. But by having these outside supports pushing inward and holding that wall in various places, the wall stays. So, okay. Um, and so we're just getting to the end here. Just wanted to show you getting back a little bit of some of the artwork of this period of the Gothic. And we're getting into the late Gothic here with the Duccio. And so I'm using this example to kind of represent all of the late Gothic artwork. There's so much to see, but I can't cover all of it. And I'm using this sculpture by Klaus Sluter, which we have already covered once in the lecture on sculpture, where I talked about it as one of the rare examples of a fully in the round sculpture that is also not freestanding, which is but anyway, here we have this The Well of Moses by Klaus Sluter, which I think is the last piece that we're talking about. Okay, thank you very much. You have a good night.